So we are now on episode 4 of our first lecture series, and what I want to talk about now is some things that the teacher of Plato, someone named Socrates, had to say about the nature of self-knowledge. So, as I've mentioned very briefly in the trailer to this class, Socrates was a Greek philosopher who lived in Athens, which was a city-state in ancient Greece, about 2,300 years ago. And he was kind of an odd bird. He didn't have a job, so far as we could tell. He was the son of a midwife mother and sculptor father. And somehow, by the time he had become middle-aged, he found himself spending a lot of time just talking with other people about deep questions that were bothering him and his friends. Questions about the nature of justice, about the nature of what is right, what is wrong, things of that sort. He'd often meet up with friends or acquaintances, ask them, and would find out that, in fact, they didn't know any better than he did. On closer questioning, find out that none of them knew very good answers to the questions about the things that seemed most important. So he became a bit of a gadfly in Athenian society. He became a bit of a nuisance for some people, even though he had a kind of a following, generally speaking, aristocratic young men, Athenians who would follow him around, engage with him in dialogue, watch as he engaged with other people in dialogue. One of the many people who followed him around was a young man named Plato, and Plato tried as best he could from memory to write down various of the things that Socrates had said in the course of his conversations with his interlocutors. So, one of the things that's in this book, Plato 5 Dialogues, is a dialogue called the Apology. Now, it's not an apology in the sense that it's a report of Socrates apologizing for anything. Rather, it comes from the Greek word apologia, which means something closer to justification, reason, rationale. Where here, Socrates has been accused by some of his fellow Athenians of behaving badly. Those accusations include such things as corrupting the youth, believing in false gods, and generally overturning Athenian society, making things uncomfortable for the powers that be. So he'd been taken to court, he had been tried, and now it was his job to defend himself, to explain himself, to justify his actions in light of the accusation that had been made against him. And I should also note that juries in these days consisted of 501 jurors, rather than the number that we normally have now in the United States, 501 of his fellow, I believe, land-holding Athenians that were going to sit and judge whether or not his case had merit, whether or not he should be condemned in some way, and how to treat him accordingly. So, there he is trying to explain that long ago, I mentioned in the trailer to the class something about the temple at Delphi, and Socrates points out on page 25 of this book, and into page 26, he says, many people think that I put myself as being more knowledgeable, somehow more important, as being above other people in Athenian society, and I don't think that's true. Now, at this time, I should mention that there was an oracle at Delphi, a temple up in the mountains outside of Athens, and people would go there to ask the priestesses who would hang out at the temple. They would ask them questions about what they should do, how they should behave, should they build ships, should they go to war, should they let their daughter marry this suitor, and so forth. And the priestess, known as an oracle, was believed to give always the correct answer. It was believed that she was not capable of giving an incorrect answer. So, Socrates is now in the middle of this apology, trying to explain himself, and he says, I shall call upon the god at Delphi as witness to the existence and nature of my wisdom, if it be such. You know Chaerephon is one of the friends, you know Chaerephon, he was my friend from youth, and the friend of most of you, as he shared your exile and your return. This is something that happened about a political event that happened in Athens. You surely know the kind of man he was, how impulsive in any course of action. But he went to Delphi at one time, and ventured to ask the oracle if any man was wiser than I, Socrates. And the oracle replied that no one was wiser. Now, this might sound crazy to you. I thought that was a ridiculous thing for the oracle to have said at first. But the oracle did say, and we believe, Socrates says, that the oracle cannot be mistaken, that no one is wiser than Socrates. Now, notice that that's not to say that Socrates is the wisest of all Athenians, but rather that there's no one who's wiser than he. And then Socrates goes on after reporting this event to point out that he went around wondering what the oracle could have meant. Why did they think that he knew, that no one knew more than he did? And he ended up finding that he would ask other people questions about the nature of, for example, justice, knowledge, truth, wisdom, and so forth, virtuous behavior. And everybody who tried to give him answers, everybody who provided answers, turned out that they had what they thought was knowledge, but it was dubious, it was questionable, it was bogus. Whereas at least Socrates was under no illusions of thinking that he knew. So his fellow Athenians, many of them, thought they knew answers, thought they were wiser than he was, but at least Socrates didn't think that. He was ignorant and was aware of the fact that he was ignorant, whereas his fellow Athenians were often ignorant, but they were, as it were, standing on stilts, thinking that they were better than he was, but they were stilts made of nothing substantial. They didn't, in fact, know more than he did. So he says, maybe the oracle was right in the following sense. Maybe what's important to know is that I at least am not under any illusions about myself. I don't think of myself as having knowledge, whereas other people think that they've got knowledge, think something about themselves, namely that they're knowledgeable at something, even though they in fact are not. So, notice that when Socrates says this, he not only invokes the oracle, but he also says something about the nature of self-knowledge, that sometimes self-knowledge can happen even if you're fairly ignorant, as long as you don't tell yourself that you've got things inside of you like knowledge. You can still be clear about the nature of that ignorance, not be under any illusions, whereas many of Socrates' compatriots were in fact under illusions about the nature of their wisdom. So that's one important thing to point out. That self-knowledge can often come in the form of just being aware of what you don't have as opposed to what you've got. Second point. Further on in the apology, I'm skipping a lot of material that happens in that dialogue, but further on in that apology, Socrates has made his case, he's defended himself as best he can, he's gone into some detail about why he lives the life that he does, and throughout that he's made it clear that it's a very important part of his life that he engage every day, as much as possible, in dialogue, in questioning, not just sitting by himself studying things, but rather talking to his friends, talking to his fellow Athenians, asking them questions, trying to get wisdom. Now, he's explained that, and then it's time for the fellow jurors, all 501 of them, to have a vote, and lo and behold, they vote that he is guilty as charged. That is, he is guilty of corrupting the youth and of creating false gods. Furthermore, Meletus, who's one of his primary accusers, has asked these jurors not just to tell them that Socrates is guilty, but also Meletus has asked for the death penalty, and the jury has agreed to do so. That is to say, now the jury has not only found Socrates guilty, but sentenced him to death, and he will eventually have to drink some hemlock, putting a poisonous liquid that will cause his death. Now, just at the very end of the dialogue, Socrates says, "Okay, I understand, I realize it, I understand that you've sentenced me to death, and I will face my death without fear." And somebody says, well, and he considers the objection, well, maybe I should just go into exile, maybe I should just leave, and that way maybe I'll just solve the problem. So he considers that question. Some people might say, Socrates, if you leave us, you will not be able to live won't you be able to live quietly just without talking? But Socrates replies, this would be incredibly difficult for me to do. If I say that it's impossible for me to keep quiet because that means disobeying what I think the most important things about life are, you might not believe me. Maybe you think I'm being ironical. On the other hand, if I say that it's the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, because, he says, the unexamined life is not worth living, you will believe me even less. Let me go back and look at that phrase, that sentence, the unexamined life is not worth living. He seems to be making a very strong claim there. Part of what he's getting at is that he doesn't think his life is worth carrying on if he cannot spend time, perhaps even every day, examining the nature of his life and the things in it that he cares about. Justice, virtue, wisdom, things of that sort. But one might wonder exactly how strong that claim is supposed to be. Many people have thought, gosh, the unexamined life is not worth living. That's an awfully strong claim. What should I make of that? I mean, after all, do I really have to, in order for my life to be worthwhile, do I really have to engage in examination all or much of the time? That seems very strong. So when I discuss this with my students here on the grounds of the university, I often ask them to think about cases like the following. Well, we do say things like the unexamined life is not worth living, but let's examine that statement and see what merit it's got. After all, suppose that there's a recent college graduate, call her Mary, and suppose she goes to a very poor country, perhaps in Eastern Europe like Moldova, and she spends all of her days trying to help out young women, to try to educate them about the ways in which they might be lured into prostitution, a kind of slavery, by men who show up in fancy cars and nice suits, telling them that they can get nice jobs in boutiques in Paris. Mary's job is to try to let these girls know that if they accept these jobs, they'll probably be forced into a kind of prostitution ring, never be able to come back home, and become sort of like slaves. So Mary has a very virtuous, very important job to do, but she also realizes that it's very exhausting, very tiring, takes a lot out of her. Now, so she spends all day going from door to door, talking to teenagers, young women in the villages of Moldova, let's suppose. At the end of the day, she doesn't have any time for any self-examination. She doesn't have any energy to sit and read philosophy or anything of the self, anything of the sort. She wants to go to sleep in order to get rested, to go work the next day. Now, if we think about literally the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, that seems to come down in a very harsh way on Mary and say her life is not worth living because she's not spending any time in self-examination. That doesn't seem very plausible. That doesn't seem very reasonable. And I don't think that Socrates probably had that in mind. So, not worth living is probably too strong an understanding of what Socrates has. But the philosopher and scholar of ancient philosophy, a professor named Richard Kraut at Northwestern University, just a bit north of Chicago, has written an article called The Examined Life, in which he argues, I think compellingly, that the proper interpretation of the phrase not worth living should require us to look back at the Greek word biotos, which means something like not to be lived. That is to say, what Professor Kraut suggests is that the proper interpretation of the line, the unexamined life is not worth living, should go something like this. The unexamined life is not to be lived, not something that you ought to do. You might very well, and you might very well live a worthwhile life in the process, but still you've been missing something by virtue of living that kind of life. And now applying it back to the case of Mary in the country of Moldova, you can imagine how, even though what she does is very important, you might still feel perhaps a little bit of sadness for her because her job is so important, so all-consuming, that she has very little time for herself and any kind of self-examination. It might still be the case that what she does is worthwhile. It might still be the case that we admire Mary for what she does. But if she has no time for any self-examination, Socrates might say, and Professor Kraut might develop this thought, if she's got no time, then you can understand why her life is missing something of some value, and you will hope at least by the time she's done with this job, goes on to move to another career, that other career perhaps will give her a little more time for reflection on herself and the nature thereof. So, when Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living, I'm suggesting that the most reasonable interpretation of that is not the very strong, very strict view that if you don't engage in self-examination, you might as well not have been born. That seems rather extreme. Rather, he's suggesting something more modest and perhaps more reasonable. That is, that if you don't engage in self-examination, then you're missing something of value. There's a kind of hole in your soul. There's something missing that'll make your life more worthwhile, which if you had, you would be living that much more of a valuable life. So, that idea that the unexamined life is not worth living can be properly interpreted, and I think interpreted in a way that has some plausibility, but of course, some plausibility doesn't mean that it's right. We might still ask the question, is it true that self-examination of the sort that the injunction to know thyself really is worthwhile at all? Does it add anything at all? That's the next question I want to move on to, and I'll see you soon when we discuss that one.